although this is the fourth talk in the series, I will do a little bit of a recap and explain where we've come to, looking through one of the many, many lists. Buddhism loves lists. You've probably heard of things like the Four Noble Truths, the Noble Eightfold Path, loads of things like that. And this is one we're looking at today, which is called the Four Essentials of Partnership, or the Four Means of Unification. And my name is Ratnaprabha. Now, I just wanted to start off with a little bit of reminiscing, because I suppose everybody has their own way into what you might call spirituality or self-development or whatever. And I was looking back and thinking, how did that happen? And one thing I can remember is the first retreat I went on. And it was a weekend, but it wasn't a Buddhist retreat. Now, my mother was a Christian, and she used to send my sister and me to Sunday school. We went up to St. Luke's Church just off Platts Lane, if you know that area. And when I was 11, she took me off on a Christian weekend retreat at this big country house. Now, I was very skeptical myself. I'd never really responded to Christianity or the idea of worshipping God and all that kind of thing. It wasn't something I was really into. But on this weekend retreat, there was a young man on the retreat who was very kind to me, who took an interest in me. And I was very struck because, 11 years old, you're starting to become a little bit self-aware at that point. You're thinking for yourself. But up to then, nobody really had taken me, apart from maybe my father, had really taken me seriously and taken an interest in me as a thinking, independent-minded person. And I can remember the emotion, my heart swelling with emotion when I felt this kindness coming from this young man as we walked down the garden. However, the next time he saw me on the weekend, he pressed some Christian pamphlets into my hands, and I felt, probably very unfairly, I felt let down in a major way. I thought, this guy is just trying to convert me, and I just felt sort of betrayal. That's what I felt. I felt this enormous disappointment. But however, I was interested in spirituality, and the channel for that turned out to be my dad rather than my mum. My parents had separated. He lived south of the river, and he lived in a small community. And that in itself was remarkable, especially in those days. He believed in community living rather than the normal model of either living by yourself or living with a partner, perhaps with children. And every month or so, the community would invite a speaker round to the big lounge they had on some aspect of spirituality. And I was round there. I used to stay with him weekends quite often. And I was round there one Saturday evening when I was maybe about 12. And who was it who came along? It was this guy. I was amazed, actually. I found a photograph of him because I remembered his name, and I found a photograph online. I'll show it to the camera as well. Is that visible there?
Yeah.
Can anybody guess what this guy was? So he had a long flowing white beard. He had actually quite long white, pure white hair. He had a receding hair, so he had a big shiny forehead like this, and a rather twinkly sort of eye. I don't know if you would guess, but you might do.
A wizard.
What was that?
A wizard.
Well, maybe he was in a way. What he was, he wasn't a monk. He was the chief druid. He was the chief druid. And his name was Dr. Thomas Morn. And amazingly, I remembered his name. And for the first time since I was 12, well, I didn't look it up then because there wasn't the internet in those days. I looked him up on the internet. There he is, this guy, Thomas Morn. So, I thought, wow, we're going to get it now. Here's the real deal. It's the chief druid talking to us. Now, he arrived with his consort, who was a beautiful young woman with auburn hair, and he was indeed the chief druid. His consort was called Jennifer, And he told all sorts of stories, which you can see if you look him up on the internet, all sorts of stories about his background. So he claimed to have fought for years in Spain in the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. He said he'd travelled to India and Tibet, towing a caravan behind his car in the 1950s, and there he claimed to have helped the Dalai Lama escape over the Himalayas to get him out when the Chinese invaded Tibet. Now, I don't remember him mentioning any of this in the talk. I don't remember anything about what he actually said in the talk, but except for one thing, because I recall him sitting there at ease, twinkling in his armchair, smiling genially and pointing to his forehead. And so we looked at his forehead, and on his forehead there was a sort of a bump or a lump. If you imagine half a walnut, about that size, imagine that stuck in your forehead, but it was a fleshly bump, on his forehead. And he explained that this was an outgrowth of his brain that he had produced when he learnt precognitive dreaming. And it was his dreams could foretell the future. And this little bump was where he had the organ for seeing into the future through his dreams. Okay. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this guy, I'm thinking about exemplification. Meeting somebody who's highly spiritual, who you're really impressed by, and you think, that's the kind of person I want to be. I didn't feel that with the Chief Druid, I'm afraid. I was quite sceptical. I was sort of brought up skeptically minded, I think, even at that age, and I didn't believe a word of it. So my first encounter with a spiritual person, or my second encounter after the Christian guy, both of them were quite disappointing. But I was fortunate a bit later on when I was a student, and then I decided to learn meditation, and I was taught by a Buddhist meditation teacher, who I'm very glad to say is still alive and teaching, whose name was Vasantara, who's a member of our order. And that was a very different experience, not just because it was straightforward. He taught me meditation. He was, a friendly, intelligent person. But also I realised he had worked on himself. He wasn't trying to convert me. He wasn't making any claims about having powers and things. He wasn't trying to be the archetype of a mystic wizard, He was just himself. But he really was impressive. He'd used his meditation to work on himself. So that was a great relief to meet that. And so the topic of the talk today is one of the many Buddhist virtues, and this virtue is called exemplification. And so the question is, if you're trying to cultivate some sort of a spiritual life, how important is it who you actually meet? How important are the people? Because you might think we can learn it from books and YouTube videos and apps that teach us meditation. We can learn it in that sort of way. We can try the practices, we can learn the teachings. Why does it matter who it is? But I've got a feeling it really does matter. The person really matters. And so I'm so pleased I was lucky with that. The person who exemplifies the qualities that we're trying to develop. We're doing the mindfulness of breathing today. How do we know what mindfulness is? Well, we do know inside what mindfulness is. But if you meet a mindful person, that makes the whole thing much, much easier, I think. So exemplification is the fourth of this list of 4 Sangrahavastus, the essentials of partnership or the means of unification. Here it says unifying and consolidating the Sangha, and I'll say more about why this word Sangha is there later on. Sangrahavastus is the word. Now, they've been our topic on Saturday mornings for the last few months. Every month we've had a talk on one of those Sangrahavastu. Now we've come to the 4th one. And they are giving or generosity, kindly speech, speaking kindly. This one, doing good, beneficial activity. And then here we have exemplification. I don't think, I'll mention later the Sanskrit term for this current one, because it is quite interesting It's very difficult to translate Buddhist terms, so sometimes it's interesting to look at the original and see what it's trying to say, but I won't go into the other ones. Now, when the Buddha originally taught these 4 Sangrahavastus, he called them the 4 things that make the world go round. The 4 things that make the world go round. And that idiom in ancient India is the similar idiom that we have today. What is it that makes the world go round? I don't mean in the sense of the planet spinning through the stars. What I mean is, how does society run smoothly? How do you have a good world, a world in which society is working properly, I suppose you could say. So there are the 4 things that make sure that society flourishes. How you build community, in other words. How do you connect with each other so that society works? And basically, society doesn't work if everybody is just in it for themselves. Maybe that's obvious, but if everybody is just going for their own immediate benefit, you can't have a flourishing society. There has to be some degree of interest in others, some degree of altruism. And you can probably see with these 4 things how they're all to do with altruism, with outward goingness, and how you relate to other people. And first of all, there is simply being generous, spotting the needs of other people, and being happy to share our own resources, our skills, and our time with others. So a healthy society is one where people are giving gifts of all sorts. I don't just mean material gifts. But that is not enough. You also need to be in communication with each other, don't you? You need to be interested in each other. And that's the second of the essentials of partnership, kind speech. Yes, communicating, but more than that, communicating in a friendly way, kindly speech. But you can go further than that, and the third of the essentials of partnership is doing good or beneficial activity. And what that means is actually living and acting in ways that are really helpful to other people. Now, I'm sure we all do this, don't we? But maybe we don't realise how important that is for making connections with other people. Even for our own benefit, it's really important to be doing these things, it seems to me. When you feel generous, when you think of somebody, why not contact them and send them a kind word? If you can see something you can do for somebody, maybe you can consider doing that. We probably always have little reservations. Oh dear, they might have expectations, or I haven't really got time, and so on. Maybe fair enough, but sometimes you can do that. And then finally, we have exemplification. Realizing that we are all in the same boat together. We're having the same challenges, and we can't just tell other people what they ought to be doing for society to run properly. We need to be doing it ourselves as well. It's very tempting, isn't it, to see what other people should be doing, and then forget that, hang on a minute, what about me? What can I do? It doesn't mean putting yourself in hardship because you're so generous all the time to others, because everybody matters. That's the Buddhist message, is that everybody matters, including us. It's not that we need to sacrifice ourselves for the benefit of others. We are important as well, but we're no more important than anybody else. Everybody matters, and I think it's wonderful if you can get that feeling when you're even in a room like this, when you're with people or the online people, think, yeah, you matter as well. You're important. You do matter. So when the Buddha originally taught these practices, he was talking about society in general and how people can get on well with each other. But he soon realized that he could elevate these virtues so that they're also ways of creating Sangha, in other words, Buddhist community. Now, the origin of this change in his view, one of the great things about the Buddha is that he was teaching for 45 years. So he was able to develop his teaching, to try things out. Very interesting, very difficult to spot this in the teachings, but you can sometimes see. Here was his first attempt. He thought, I think this is really good for a smooth society. And then he realized, no, you can see these in a deeper way, where they create Buddhist Sangha. So there was a town in the Indian hills on the edge of the jungle called Alavi. And this is where a man called Hataka lived. And I told you the story a few weeks ago of how Hataka got his name. His name means hand-me-down. And the story involves, I haven't got time to tell you again, but the story involves his escape from a man-eating ogre with the Buddha's help. Anyway, when Hataka was a young man, he met the Buddha again. This was such a remote place. The Buddha would do a lot of touring around, but he'd only arrive in this remote place every few years. So he meets the Buddha again. And Hataka was walking down a forest track on the way back into town, the town of Alavi, when he saw a human shape lying on a pile of leaves by the side of the track. Now, the weather at the time was very cold. I know it was India, but this was up in the hills after all, and sometimes it does get cold. And this person, lying on a heap of leaves, was the Buddha. And the Buddha was just waking up in the morning, and Hataka felt really sorry for him. He had enormous sympathy. He said, what a life, wandering in the open air, without even a tent, sleeping on the ground, you know. So he started chatting to the Buddha about this. And they entered into conversation, and the Buddha compared his life with Hataka's. Hataka was well off. He had everything he needed. He had good stories to tell about his childhood when he met the ogre. But he wasn't really happy deep down. That's what he realized talking to the Buddha. He wasn't really happy deep down, even though he had everything. While the Buddha was in a state of continuous calm and happiness, despite having no roof over his head, no possessions, apart from a cloak and a begging bowl. That's all the Buddha had. But yet he was really happy. So Hataka was quite struck by this. And he became a disciple of the Buddha, and the Buddha taught him meditation and how to practice. Now, 5 years later, the Buddha turns up again. He's not been there in between, it's such a remote place. But to his great surprise, when the Buddha turned up in Alavi the next time, what did he find? He found a Buddhist centre, a thriving Buddhist centre, with 500 people regularly attending the centre, all of it set up by Hataka. And the Buddha asked Hataka, how did you do this? How did you produce such a wonderfully harmonious Sangha in the 5 years since we met last? And Hataka said to the Buddha, well, don't you remember? You taught me these 4 essentials of partnership. You taught them to me, that's what you did. And that's how I connect with people. If I feel I can connect through generosity, then I give. If I feel I can connect with people through kindly speech, then that's what I do. I speak kindly. If I feel I can connect through beneficial activity, then I do what I can for them. And if I can connect through exemplification, then we discover what we all have in common. And the Buddha endorsed what Hataka said and said, that is just the way to form a thriving, harmonious Buddhist community. And so the Buddha started teaching the Sangrahavastus as more than just something needed for a smooth running society, for social cohesion in ordinary society, but something that is also important in building something like this, a group of people who are trying to practice meditation together, trying to practice Buddhism. And the difference here is that the community of people who are committed to working on themselves, to become more compassionate, more ethical, and to be in as creative a frame of mind as possible using meditation, and also to achieve the profound wisdom and compassion of awakening or Buddhahood itself. So that's what a Sangha is, people who are trying to do that. Whether or not they call themselves Buddhists, in a way that's just a label, isn't it? So Sangha means people practicing together. And there's one really crucial point that I want to convey in this talk. And I hope that you go away with this point and just think about it and see what it means for you. And that is that what we're doing here in this room, and what we're doing with the people online as well, and with everybody who connects through an interest in Buddhist practice, is that we are collectively creating Sangha. Sangha is not something provided. It's not like an existing club that you say, okay, I'll pay my dues and I'll join the club. Right, there you go, and I'll follow the rules, I'll just do whatever you say. It's something that we all create together. Even if you're here for the very first time, in a way you're involved in creating Sangha. Just by being here and by being interested and connecting with each other. It doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be in the long term a regular attender here. You may or may not. That's up to you entirely, isn't it? But all of us, it seems to me, are creating Sangha. And we do it through the Sangravastus, through the essentials of partnership. So I'm just thinking about this business of whether you participate, whether we're doing something communal or whether one's doing something on one's own. And if you go home now and you say, oh, I'm going to listen to a podcast, I'm going to watch a video on history or some other interesting subject, what you are, I would say, is a consumer. You're a consumer of that information. And it may be really fascinating and you get really involved and, oh, that's interesting, I'd like to follow that up. You're taking in the information. Maybe you're finding it interesting. Maybe you're pleased with the presentation. Maybe you're a bit critical of the presentation. And the same goes for a lot of things that we do in life. Modern life is a consumerist life, inevitably. That's what happens. We are choosing what we want, and then we're paying for it usually, and then we're taking it home. That's what you do when you go to Tesco's, really, and that's what we do with our podcasts and so on as well to some extent. Now, there's nothing to stop you regarding something like a Buddhist centre in the same way. You can come along, you can be taught meditation or taught about Buddhism, and you can just take it home, and that's fine. So I'm not trying to dissuade you from doing that. If that is what works for you, that is fine. But there is this other level, the participative level, where we're not just consuming our practice, but we are also connecting with each other. And that's what Sangha means. It's not an evening class institute where you come along to learn how to speak Spanish or something like that. It's a little bit different, at least I hope it's a little bit different, even though you can use it in the same way. And real connection, people practicing together, is one of the most important values in Buddhism. And without that, I would say, in the end, it's impossible to make progress. You can make a certain amount of progress, but unless there's that Sangha element, that connecting element, you'll come to a block eventually, or you'll just lose interest. And I hope that you'll find that the Sangrahavastus are happening here at the North London Buddhist Centre. I hope you'll find giving, for example. So here we've got quite a few people who are on the team for this class. There's Vajramitra here looking after the computer. There's Shantisara, who was teaching the newcomers meditation. There's Kusala, who was here teaching the regulars meditation. There was Magda downstairs doing the announcements. And we had other people on the team. There's Marie over there who was on reception. So there's loads of people who are giving in many ways in the centre. And everybody here in the class is giving just by participating, by being here. And also, I want to mention this, by helping to finance the centre. So if you gave money when you came here, that's how the centre runs. It's incredibly expensive to run a building like this. So that is fantastic, that giving. And giving means going beyond yourself. And we can always do that. We can always look out for the needs of others, even though there's a little bit of resistance to that. And it's really worth it, I think. But also kind communication, breaking down the barriers of shyness, looking out for people who are new. If you come here, for example, because sometimes, I remember for several years when I first started going to Buddhist centres, I always sat in the corner and felt really shy. And then I realised that I wasn't the only one like that. That actually, all one had to do was to just enter into conversation. And, it's very inhibiting when you feel, I don't know anybody here. And especially when you see a clique, which you will do sometimes here, when you see a group of people animatedly chatting together. They obviously know each other really well. You think, oh, I'll never get into that, You feel a bit sort of left out. So kind communication means overcoming that, being interested in people, even expressing affection, and doing good as well, living and acting in ways that make a difference to those around us, particularly sharing any benefits you've found in a place like this. So when the elevated way of teaching the Sangrahavastu, doing good or beneficial activity wasn't just helping somebody put the bins out. It was actually particularly sharing what you've learned, the spiritual things that you've learned with other people. So just to give you an example, if you've learned meditation, you can teach it to somebody else. You don't have to be qualified. You don't have to have any certificates. You don't have to sort of be some wonderful meditator. If you know the stages of the mindfulness of breathing, you can tell your flatmate how to do it, or your brother or your sister or your mother or your father or whatever, or even at people at work, a little group together to meditate. So that's a really fantastic way of doing good, is sharing what you've learned or what you've found useful yourself. Maybe you've had certain insights into yourself or human nature through learning about Buddhism, and these also can be shared. So we can create Sangha through giving, through loving communication, and through beneficial activity. But exemplification is much more subtle, and it's a difficult one to go into. Now the word is samanarthata. 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 And this has two components to it. It literally means the same benefit or the same purpose. Artha means aim or benefit or purpose or the good, and samana means the same, sameness or equality. And it comes from a realization that we are all in the same boat together. It's very easy sometimes to see differences and divisions between people, and this is highlighted in the news nowadays, isn't it? And when you see the difference of another person from you, when you realize how different they are, it's then all sorts of things that can happen. For example, they can seem frightening or unapproachable and distant, or they can seem even threatening, or maybe they can seem disgusting, or they can seem fascinating. There's all sorts of ways that we respond to difference. They can even seem alien, different and separate. And it's natural to have these responses, to be looking after ourselves, to be defending ourselves. However, we do have so much in common with each other. Now, do we actually have the same underlying unifying purpose? And I'm not going to answer that question. I'm going to ask you to think about that a little bit, and maybe in future weeks we can look at that. Do we have a yearning for the same benefits? And I would be interested to hear in future weeks what you think about that. How much do we really have in common? Do we really have very different needs from each other or not? And what's the result of just trying to consider that? Now, the Tibetans look at this in two different ways, the Tibetan Buddhists. The first one might seem rather exotic, because it's the assertion, everybody has been your mum. Have you heard this one? If you go to a Tibetan centre and so on, that's what they'll say. Everybody has been your mum. Now, what do they mean by that? Well, of course, this assumes rebirth. It assumes hundreds of thousands of years of rebirth over and over again, in which every possible relationship between people must have existed at some time. So if you do believe in rebirth, and this means that we all feel connected. In a sense, we're all part of the same family. And everybody we meet at one stage or another was our partner, was our child, was our parent, was whatever. Now, you might not want to take this literally, but it's an interesting way of looking at things, seeing our close and interweaving ancestral connections with each other. It's a great way of breaking down barriers. And it's very important in the Sangha to recognize that what we have in common. Now, the second way the Tibetans talk about this is everybody wants happiness, everybody wants to avoid suffering. It's a very simple thing to say, isn't it? Everybody wants things to go better. Everybody wants to deal with the problems in their life. And we have that in common. And it may seem just obvious to say it. Well, why bother to say that? But if you can really get that, then you can start to forgive people. Because people, I am very, very clumsy. I make mistakes. I say the wrong thing. All sorts of things go wrong. But if you can see that behind that there's a good basics and basic goodwill, I'm just trying to find my own happiness, just as you are as well, then we can start to feel that we have something in common. we can be motivated to overcome our differences and our animosities. So all those blundering, that making mistakes, that causing trouble to others, it's not that we really want to cause trouble. It's just that we're seeking our own benefit, and so are the other people. So let's join in this process, in seeking benefit in general, rather than trying to jostle each other in the crowd as we feel we're competing for benefit. You probably heard this idea of the zero-sum game. If one person wins, the other person loses. That seems to be one issue with the Olympics, isn't it? You know, people get a gold medal, and sometimes the person getting the silver medal feels they're a complete failure. My goodness, they are the second best person in the world at this. But yet they are, sometimes silver medalists obviously are really pleased. But sometimes, if they think, oh, I didn't get the gold. And that's the trouble. That is a zero-sum game in a way. But life doesn't have to be like that. It doesn't have to be a constant competition for medals. Even wonderful though the Olympics is. So what do we have in common? Well, realizing that we're in the same boat is quite a subtle insight. It's something that comes gradually. It sort of dawns on us more and more clearly, and then we lose it and forget about it, and then we feel separate once again. But why is this realization important for creating Sangha? Maybe that's obvious, but the old Buddhist texts draw a number of conclusions, 3 in particular, when they tried to explain samanarthata, when they tried to explain this Sangrahavastu. So the first meaning, according to the old texts, is a perfect even-mindedness. The second one is a sense of harmony and empathy with others, because we all at bottom have similar priorities. And the third one is exemplification, exemplifying a life that is conducive to enlightenment. So I'll just say a little bit about these. So the even-mindedness comes from the sense that everybody is important and that our own aims are not intrinsically more important than anybody else's. In fact, deep down they're the same. So we can go through life just responding to the current situation as best we can, but not being too nervous and too protective about it, because often we'll realise that other people are struggling with the same stuff. And we can share in the joys and the sorrows of others. And this connects us. And it also connects us with the second of the meanings of samanarthata, which is empathy. Now, I guess it's clear that if we realise we're all in the same boat, we will have empathy. We'll have at least a sense of what it's like to be the other person, the person we're with. And if they have a difficulty, we can imagine what it would be like for us. And we can respond in a kind and a helpful way. Asanga is one of the great Buddhist teachers from 1500 years ago, and he says that empathy means compliance with the minds of others. Compliance with the minds of others. Getting in tune with others. And firstly, there's this general point that we're all human beings. We're all seeking happiness. We're avoiding suffering. And this is sharpened very much by ego, which means we make all these mistakes while we're doing that. And they are subjects like we are. They are the centre of everything. Where is the centre of the universe? It's here, because everything is around me. But I have to realise that you're the centre of the universe as well. We're all the centre of the universe. And if we realise that about each other, then we can't help but have empathy. But there's a more specific empathy in coming to know people's individual natures and dispositions, and in a way understanding their differences from us as well. What they're like, so we can relate in an appropriate way, an intelligent way. And we don't need to communicate in the same way with everybody, because after all, we are all different as well as all being the same at the same time. I'm not going to go into detail here, but I think this is interesting. How do you understand what other people are like? And there's one very useful little distinction that Sangrahavastu, my teacher, makes here. He says, we've got 3 aspects. We've got character, we've got personality, we've got individuality. Your character is your basic, underlying, mainly inborn nature. That is the kind of person you are. And you could even recognise that when you were a child. Your personality is the way you present yourself to others in particular, the way you come across to others. And it's good to realise that that is not all we are. The way we come across to others, there's other parts of us that we don't show or that people take a long time to see. And then individuality, which is the you that has developed through personal growth, especially ethically. And interestingly, when you say to somebody, well, just be yourself, are you saying be your character? Are you saying be your personality? Or are you saying be yourself as a true individual, deeply down? Anyway, that might be something interesting to talk about in future weeks, possibly. So we can empathise, we can recognise we're in the same boat, but where is the boat going? And this is where exemplification comes in. And the thing about Buddhism for me is that it's not just about coming to terms with our situation, finding a way of coping, even being cheerful in our situation, but it also realises there's a lot wrong. There's a lot wrong with the world, and there's a lot wrong with us as well, with our own individual ways of responding to the world. So this means we need to change. We need to cultivate the qualities of enlightenment. And we can read about these qualities, and then you can try and strengthen them in yourself. You can meditate. You can do the metta bhavana so that you're becoming kinder. Your love becomes stronger. But in the end, we need something else. We need exemplification. Now, maybe not everybody, maybe some people can do without this, but I think that we need exemplification. I mean, actually seeing those qualities embodied in other people. So can you really cultivate metta, kindness, if you've never met a kind person? Of course, we've all met kind people, but maybe we've forgotten about it. We just need to remember, get in touch with them again. So, when I was a child, I encountered exemplars. And there were lots of them, but I mentioned two at the beginning. There was the young Christian man who took an interest in me, and then there was the chief druid. And then I also mentioned the Santre who taught me meditation. And the chief druid was interesting because he really did look the part. He looked like the wise elder, the wizard, the learned guru with special powers because of his little bump. But all I saw was a display of spirituality. I saw an image of the wise old man. I didn't actually see it in practice. I didn't relate to it sort of personally. And with the young Christian, although he genuinely may have been kind, I felt betrayed and let down, and all he wanted to do was convert me. And when people come to Buddhism, they may have heard about great enlightened Tibetan lamas or Zen masters, and it's not unusual to have a yearning to meet someone like that. You want to meet the real deal, the enlightened teacher. And that would obviously be great, there's nothing wrong with that. But also behind it may be the sense that then we won't have to do any work. We can just bask in the grace waves that emanate from that person, and we can slip blissfully into an enlightened state. But even the Buddha wasn't like that with people. You remember, Hattika was on his own for 5 years, and he had to do the work himself. He couldn't just sit there at the feet of the Buddha and be enlightened by somebody else. That doesn't work. He had to create Sangha. So it's not enough to hope for other people to exemplify the quality we want to develop. If we think we've met the qualities in some perfect enlightened teacher, that might even be unhelpful, because it might distance us from them and feel that there's something separate from us. We feel daunted, inadequate, a different species, or we just get complacent. So it's worth just thinking of the people that you really admire. Do you admire them as you might gaze at a beautiful building, or as you might see a magnificent tiger in the zoo, without being able to relate personally to it? But maybe you say, no, this is an aspect of what I'm trying to do. So exemplification is not a question of hanging around like a vampire, waiting for a spiritually advanced person to come along. Exemplification is something we do for each other. That's what I want to come to, really. It's not to do with just meeting wonderfully impressive people. We can be impressive to each other in different ways. We all have our own specialities. But the way we're impressive is not necessarily by being a wonderful meditator, being perfectly ethical, being full of wisdom. It's by actually doing it. It's by trying. It's the effort that we exemplify. And that is the most inspiring thing. If you meet somebody you feel is really committed to working on themselves, to doing their meditation, even though the meditation may be, as it were, rubbish, even though they may have got things all over the place, even though they may make terrible ethical mistakes and treat people badly sometimes, but if they're learning from it, that is the exemplification I think we need. So what is exemplified is not perfection. What is exemplified is the process, a sense of commitment to working on oneself. So we exemplify the process. And if you come along to a Buddhist center, you will be meeting what you might call senior Buddhists. And some of the people you meet here at the Buddhist center may have been practicing the Dharma, Buddhist teachings for many, many years. They may have become ordained. They may have been given a nice kesa, which signifies ordination, a fancy Sanskrit name. But that doesn't mean they're any better than people who haven't got those things. It's really important to realise that. It doesn't actually tell you anything immediately, apart from a commitment to practicing has been recognised. And of course, if you're openly presenting yourself as Buddhist, if you're meeting the projections, the expectations that involves, then there's a great temptation to hypocrisy, to pretending to be better than you are. But that is not what empathy is about. So empathy is about exemplifying ethical practice, exemplifying meditation practice by actually trying it, and exemplifying wisdom to the extent that you are trying to be clearer about your life. So my conclusion around the 4 essentials of partnership is that there comes a time when one needs to transfer from being a consumer of Buddhism to being a participant in Buddhist life. And that will come at a very different point for very different people. It's not something that can be hurried. It's an individual personal decision if you get to that point. But it's a bit as if one has been visiting art galleries for many, many years, and then suddenly you realise, sheet of paper, paintbrush, I can make marks on a sheet of paper, couldn't I? I could do it. I could do that myself. I don't have to just look at these wonderful works of art. And at first you think, oh, it's such rubbish compared to all this. But no, you do it. You're participating, and even you're participating in a community of artists, people who are sharing their work with each other and so on. So the main thing a Buddhist centre can offer, it seems to be, is not education in meditation and Buddhism. The main thing is Sangha, a community of people who are practicing and who connect with each other. And Sangha is created collectively. It's not something which is provided. If we want to create it, we can use these essentials of partnership. We can be giving, we can be speaking to each other with kindness and affection, we can be actively helpful, especially sharing our insights, our learnings with others. And most of all, we can exemplify. We can recognise we're all in the same boat, but we are actively working to keep the boat moving and to keep the crew happy. To do that, we need to get to know each other. And the tea break we've just had is an example of that, isn't it? In a way, the tea break is more important than the talk. You just think it's a chance to relax, but it is a chance to meet people. It's a chance to be human together and discover that we are in the same boat, we're different, we're interesting, and so on, So I really hope that we make use of those connections that we can make here. We can share our discoveries and inspirations, we can share our challenges and our frustrations and so on. And we can learn what Buddhist practice is by trying it out, but also by empathetically observing the practice of other people. So that's how you exemplify the Buddhist path. Not by being perfect, but by committing to growth. Now, when I got into Buddhism, my dad was very, very encouraging because he could see it would be good for me. He had a positive idea of Buddhism. But when I asked for ordination, his heart sank because he thought I was lost. Because for his whole life, he'd been doing the old-fashioned equivalent of listening to loads of podcasts, watching loads of YouTube clips, Alan Watts, the Dalai Lama, Hindu gurus, Sufi mystics, all that kind of thing. Like a sort of a spiritual thali in an Indian restaurant, trying little samples of things. But committing to one of those many options meant he felt that you must be missing something important that was in the others. And as a result, he was effectively on his own. I felt really sorry for that. He never really had a Sangha. So when I committed to Buddhism, he felt that I'd let myself down, and I got drawn into one exclusive organisation. But actually, I'm glad I did do that. I'm pleased to do it. So I think sooner or later, you need to give something a really good try, one particular tradition a good try, one particular Sangha a good try, rather than just hopping from one to another and never really going deeply. There's the image, isn't there, of digging a well. You don't dig 3 feet here and think, oh, there's no water there. I'll try over here. You dig 3 feet there. Oh, there's no water there. Try over here. You've got to dig really deep to get to the water. Now, I was racking my brains as to how to finish this talk. I couldn't think of any way of finishing it off. And I do not know how to finish. But then it occurred to me that one of the most important things that we can exemplify for each other is not knowing. Not knowing. And when you're leading classes, it's tempting always to have an answer. But do I really know? And I think that this exposes one of my own biggest personal delusions, which is thinking that there is somewhere a piece of knowledge, a fact, somewhere out there that will provide the solution to all my problems, even to provide the solution to the problems of the world. If only I can read enough books, listen to enough, watch enough episodes of QI, the fact, the truth will come through. Oh, that's the one. And I've done that. I spent my time amassing knowledge, reading more and more, looking up, keeping up to date with science, which is my background, all that kind of thing, trying to understand religion and history and things like that. But really, there is a level of awareness, of deep knowledge, which is not knowledge of facts. And that's what I need to be starting to uncover in my own mind. But it takes something much more difficult than study and memorization. It needs me to really sit quietly and spaciously and to open up to my own not knowing until I'm no longer separate from that. So yes, not knowing is my sort of conclusion to the talk. And I think I'll leave it there.